All right, everybody. Hello and welcome. This is the Daily Discussion Podcast where even the best ideas are challenged. Sitting down with me is a good friend of mine named BJ Carpenter. We're doing a part 2 of the Hermetic principles. We actually already did a part 1. The audio was a little bit bad. I think it should be good this time. But BJ is, I would say, is an expert when it comes to the occult, Hermeticism, ancient wisdom, stuff like that. So he's got a few notes. We went over the first, I believe we went over the first 3 Hermetic principles, and we touched on the 4th. So maybe we'll start with the 4th one, go a little more in depth with it, and then move on from there. Is there anything you want to preface this with before we get started?
Yeah, I got this headphone jacked up to Bluetooth, so hopefully you guys can't hear my breathing or anything weird like that. Hopefully it works out this time. Yeah, we talked about a slight introduction to Hermeticism, what that's all about. We talked a little bit about the first 3 principles, and we kind of put our own little spin on them. We didn't talk too much in depth about them, I suppose, in their own context. We're kind of giving them to people and then talking about them in our own terms, right? In the ways that we would interpret them instead of going to the source and almost doing like a book review of sorts. We're not doing it verbatim, right? I just want to start with that.
Yeah, and I think one of the main differences between, the realm of science and objectivity and ancient wisdom like occultism is that it's open to interpretation. You kind of can read it a few times and you can take out you can extrapolate different truths each time you encounter them. So I think that's a key distinction.
Absolutely, yep. And so when we move on with the last couple here, and we talk about them, I'm probably going to end up interjecting a bit and injecting a bit of my own philosophy into it. We'll talk about some things. So I'm really excited. Thanks for having me on again.
Oh, no problem. I love having you on, man. It's always good to talk to you. So I guess we'll start with number 4. And by the way, 1 through 3, you can find in a previous video. I just want to let y'all know.
Yeah, so we're moving on to polarity. We talked a little bit about it before, but what polarity is in essence is dualism in a nutshell. I was going to actually read off some quotes like I did the first time that we had our discussion in the first podcast. Usually in the book, every chapter has a set of quotations by which I wanted to read, but I lent my book to someone else and I'm not prepared with those quotes. So we'll just talk about polarity as we know what it is. So polarity, again, in the word polar, polarity is dualism. It means, the difference of all of manifest reality, everything in creation, everything you can think about has 2 sides to it. There's light and dark, there's love and hate, there's heat and cold, do and don't do, there is and there isn't, right? Like you can decide to wake up in the morning or you can decide to stay in bed, but that's a choice, right? You have a choice to or not to do. And this idea of polarization kind of permeates every aspect of reality as we know it. As a human being, we have to exist within this law. There are some very deep truths in dealing with what's called dualism and the philosophy of dualism and non-dualism, which is a very Eastern idea in origin. In which, we talked about in the beginning in the first video, where all is one, all is mind. If you were to posit that all is one, you're basically stating that dualism is an illusion. Duality is an illusion. The fact that you and I are both separated, we're not the same human being. This couch.
How do we reconcile that?
So that's a little further down the way, I think. I think that's coming.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to save it right here.
Yeah, save that.
We'll come back to it. All right.
Definitely. Because, but it's just the difference, right? So non-dualism posits that everything is one and that the fact that you perceive things to be different is simply an illusion. And I referenced the term Maya, which is a Hindu concept, meaning where we derive the word magic from, or illusion, the floor of reality. But polarity essentially is that, right? It's duality, and it basically means that all things as they exist at their poles, like hot and cold, are the same phenomenon in character. They're the same thing. Hot and cold are the same thing, but they are different in degree. right? Because if you were to go look at your thermostat, and this is an example that's given in the book, if you were to look at your thermostat, it shows hot and cold. And there's a bit of a red spot for heat, and then in the middle you've got neutral, and then it goes to blue for AC. And you kind of just turn the dial, and where does cold stop and where does heat begin? Can you answer that?
I personally cannot. I want to give one example of polarity, and I want you to tell me if it's legit, because I'm not an expert when it comes to occultism. But somebody once made the point to me for this specific principle that the same brain chemical is released in moments of intimacy as in moments of rage. So it's
Yeah.
like it's the same thing, but in different degree.
Definitely, yeah. So like all of the emotional states can be categorized as the same thing with difference in degree. Like fear and courage are the same emotion; they come from the same place. It's just by what degree are they different? So you could imagine these most people look at the world dualistically, right? They see things as definitely different. So when you tell them
Right.
like fear and courage are the same thing, that doesn't make sense to them. But ultimately, in the example that you gave, I would agree that laughter and crying are so close to being the same thing, right?
Right.
The same expression of emotion. They're just
Can I ask you, you said that this wouldn't make sense to the average individual, and I'm inclined to agree. Would you say that this was pretty well understood by most people at least some point in time in some society? Was there ever a time where this was common knowledge?
Probably. Yeah, I mean, it is definitely ancient wisdom stuff. From Hermetism itself is old.
Right. Although it's not as old as they thought it was originally. They originally thought it was actually older than the Ten Commandments, but it turns out that wasn't true.
Yeah, so a lot like New Age revival of old esoteric knowledge, there's a lot of what I would call, and some people would deem as not plagiarism, but what's the term? Forgery, right? It's like forged documents. People are lying all the time about, who wrote this and this text authorship, and how old is this, because somehow people feel like that how old it is equates or is indicative of its quality, right? Or of its believability.
In what way is lying similar to telling the truth then? If does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. In something like, when it comes to authorship, I personally am very critical of people who put forward documents that claim authorship of those documents, or for instance, like an occult text that a lot of people know are the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, the Atlantean. So of the same sort of region in which the Hermetic principles come from, a person by the name of Dr. Doriel claimed to have found some tablets that he translated of his own volition. He's the one and only person who has access to the manuscript and to the original tablets, which are now lost to antiquity. But at the time of his life, he somehow was the only person to gain access to this, and then he translated these documents, and now all posterity has access to them. Whether or not his authorship is authentic doesn't necessarily take away from what he's putting in to his text, in the same way that it doesn't matter if a story is fiction, it can still really teach some great lessons, right? But we have to also discuss authorship and authenticity in its own category if that is something that we care about. Should we always care about it? No. But should we always care about it? No, but we should care about it in certain circumstances, depending on what we're talking about, especially if we're trying to refute a religion based on its authorship, or, I don't know, talk about the validity claim to some knowledge that a person has with a messiah complex. It's important to keep in mind authenticity and authorship, but it's not make it or break it, especially when it comes to the unveiling of what is veiled.
So that totally makes sense. And another thing that I came to realize when I was studying polarity is that I think one of the most pertinent examples to my viewers, as far as polarity goes, would be the right and the left, right? But
Yep.
one of the things that I started to notice when I was looking into these phenomena is that if you watch two people on polar opposites of the political spectrum debate, to a degree, they're actually talking about the same thing. Their
Yeah.
solution is almost exactly the same, but it just varies. The variation is so much less than the similarity.
It manifests differently. Usually the intent is the same, right? Because through the principle,
Right.
every object or phenomenon that we're discussing that has polarity in its own manifestation is actually one thing, expressing itself as a spectrum of
Right.
things, right? And that's indicative of that for sure. Again, back to the whole, when does heat stop? When does cold start? When does cold stop and when does heat start? These subjective ideas that we have of these phenomena, like light and dark, right? If I turn off the light in here, it's definitely dark. And if I turn the light on, it's definitely light, bright in here. But at which point, how much do I have to dim this light before I make the assumption that it's dark, even though there's still light coming from that bulb? That moves us forward a little bit into rhythm, and I don't quite want to get there yet, but this whole idea of trying to pick and choose where these poles stop and start is in essence the principle of rhythm, but it also is indicative of polarity being one thing. Each item is one, expressing itself as a multitude.
Would you say that without polarity, there would be no means to make choices in life? Does that make sense?
Yes.
I've wondered that before. Like, if there was no such thing as light and dark, I couldn't decide whether I wanted to be in a well-lit room or the dark. You know,
Right.
if it wasn't for these dualities, I wouldn't be able to make all the choices that I make throughout my normal daily life.
Absolutely. So to talk about some etymology for a second, the word decide actually comes from I believe it's a Greek word that means to cut, so to decide, to make a decision is to sever opportunity in half. You have a mental image of what could be, and you sever it in half, and you take a piece of it, and another piece flies off into the unmanifest. So every decision, every doing versus not doing is moving on a set of railroad tracks that's taking you to a location always, and everything that you don't do is infinite possibility, a multitude of infinite possibility that's falling off of those tracks into the void, into the unmanifest, which is the principle of non-dualism, right? There's a creation myth. I'll give it to you like this, okay? So follow with me here. In the beginning, there was absolutely nothing. I may have told you this before, but in the beginning, there was nothing. Nothing was totally and terribly bored because I had nothing to do. Yeah, I kind of have to follow this line of logic. I understand nothing can't be bored if it's nothing, but just follow me here. Nothing had nothing to do. So it was so terribly bored that it sought to create anything at all, in order to be fulfilled. Because if it could create something to fulfill itself, it would be whole. It would be wholesome. It could rest. It would be satisfied. So out of the nothingness came the manifestation of the first ever somethingness. And that first somethingness, now existing, fulfills the nothing. The void is full. The empty space has taken root. A form has taken hold of the empty space. Now that the emptiness has something to fulfill it, it is wholesome. It's satisfied. But the something now only has nothing by which it can verify its own existence. It itself is not fulfilled. Because in order to represent yourself as an individual, or to have self-knowledge, to have meta-knowledge, you have to go outside of the system and look back at that system to gain self-knowledge, right? So in order for the one thing, for the first manifested thing, to verify its own existence and weigh itself on a scale of sorts, in order to be itself of its own agency, it must imply that there's another thing, but all there is nothing. So this one something has no choice but to go within itself, to reflect upon itself,
Mm.
and it looks at itself as if it were a mirror, and it retreats inside. And then that is the first reflection, the first dualism, from the nothingness to the somethingness, and then from the somethingness to the anythingness as it goes inwards and reflects. And that first initial reflection, being the first true duality, apart from nothing and something, is the Trinity, the first number 3, which is talked about in so many different religions and mythologies, and the Trinity. And as it goes within, it's starting a series of reflections upon reflections upon reflections, almost as if in a fun house, in a mirror room. And now it's reflecting, 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 reflecting. It's one unity as an illusion of duality. And this is reality we have. So dualism is an illusion of the one manifest unity, which is Godhead, or whatever you might call it. That's the idea.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I'm going to have to go back and listen to that, probably just that one segment 2 more times to fully understand it. But I think I do get where you're coming from. That's actually the foundation of which the daily discussion is built upon. I released a blog, I think, touching on this a little bit. But in order to truly think about something, you do have to split yourself. And you have to, you almost have to create 2 different parts of yourself and let them kind of battle it out for you to really figure out what's going on. I mean, that's the foundation that the daily discussion is built on. You know, no idea goes unchallenged.
Sure.
If you, go ahead.
Metacognition,
Right.
the act of thinking about the process of thinking, taking a system and removing yourself from the system and reviewing the system from an objective standpoint is the essence of metacognition. And it's how we grow. I mean, it is the way that we truly, truly should be operating in our day-to-day lives. And we're actually getting way ahead of ourselves, because that's something we're going to talk about in gender, the principle of gender.
Right. Is that the final principle, gender?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, cool. So I guess we're moving on to rhythm now. Do you have the quote in front of you, or are you just going to kind of unpack it?
I guess the last thing that I want to say, and then we'll move into rhythm of polarity, now that we kind of gave the mythic story of creation, which we're just going to take as an axiom as we move forward in this discussion, is positive and negative, right? Positive and negative is at the foundation of science, because we were speaking about science before in the last video, you know, talking about the structure of an atom, the nucleus, the electron, the proton, what these things mean, electromagnetism, and the forces that be the 4 forces of the cosmos. Positive and negative are huge, and reflecting on what positivity and negativity mean in terms of electromagnetism is huge, and how they work together in order to give form to what is here. I just wanted to kind of put that in people's brain, and also mention masculine and feminine as dualism, as poles of the same energy or the same force of creation. Right. But we'll get there. So yeah, we're going to go ahead and move forward. There was something that I wanted to talk about and give another example. If there's time, we can come back to it. We should move forward, because I don't know how we're doing on time.
We're doing all right. We'll come back to it.
Yeah, it's love and hate, right? I want to really talk about love and hate, and symbolically what they mean in the force of creation itself. But we can come back.
Okay.
So moving on, the next principle is rhythm, and it leads straight off of polarity. Of course, you have the poles, of which is 1, and the spectrum in between is rhythm, right? Rhythm is basically the up and the down, as if it's a wave form. If you envision a wave, there's 2 poles, every point in between is the wave function. And vibration plays into this as well. These ancient Hermetists were speaking about things that modern science, again, is very, very much propound, or what's the word I'm looking for? Expounding upon, or promulgating.
Now, can I ask you real quick, what would you say in the face of the claim that it's confirmation bias that leads you to believe that this ancient wisdom has some similarity to science? I'm not saying I believe that. I'm just asking what your explanation would be for something like that.
Well, I wouldn't see it as confirmation bias, because there's plenty of actual proof out there for anyone to go look at. There's so many documents that you can see where modern science and academia is influenced by, and oftentimes the main proponents of science and the ones who are shifting the paradigms the most, Isaac Newton, Copernicus, Pythagoras, even Aristotle, if you want to count him as a scientist, he was, if not, one of the first.
Right.
These people, they were operating on a different worldview, and science as an institution definitely has been evolving and emerging over the course
Right.
of a long period of time. And obviously, we in the postmodern era are going to look at the world differently than those people did, almost to the degree in which we live in a different reality than they did sometimes. But there is enough proof out there. You can go look at these people's texts. You can read Isaac Newton's work. You can read his corpus. You can read these things and see the influences, the alchemical influences, the Masonic influences. You can look at the Renaissance era magic tome grimoire versus the Inquisition and the
Right.
Catholic Church versus like true science, and see how they're kind of all just enmeshed within each other. I'm not necessarily equating science with those things. I'm just saying I would definitely not call it confirmation bias to say
Right.
that science stems
You could
from.
almost make the argument that all information is borrowed, and it's been this giant timeline of human beings existing that we've, had people that could look back on the timeline and extrapolate different pieces to put together the final picture. And we haven't even really fully formulated the final picture. That's what makes conversations like this so interesting. But I do believe that the best scientists who exist are the ones who can look to the past, extrapolate the wisdom that was already instantiated, and then use that to put together some new theory. I think that's the most exciting aspect of science.
Absolutely. We're digressing a bit, but to speak on that notion quickly, I do have a sort of, I guess, a criticism of modern academia in which scientists are not as interested as studying the history of their science and their craft as they are pushing the envelope and moving forward with innovation, because we do live and exist in a society which is heavily motivated by competition and the free market, money, capitalism. These are endeavors. These are things that we have to think about all day, every day. We have to pay our bills. We have to feed our kids. Most people who go into the field of science are going into science because it interests them, and then they find their way into niche jobs that require their services and their skills and their skill sets, and they need to be at the cutting edge of what is happening today. They need to know the latest and greatest, and that's what they need to be focusing on because of the nature of our society as we built it. That's not to say no one is a student of the history of science. It's not the majority of scientists, right?
Yeah, and if the claim that you and I are making is correct, and I think you and I are making the same claim, anyone who is a student of science, even if they don't know it, they're a student of history. To
a degree. Definitely.
To a degree, right? Yeah, perfect. In line with what we're talking about. So, rhythm. Let's you and I, we tend to get off.
We can come back. But so rhythm, right? It's the in-betweens of the poles, the in-betweens of the polarity, the shades or the shadows, right? If there's light and dark, it's the shadow that's in between. Rhythm is very similar to polarity, but what it means, or what it did mean to the Hermetists, is mental alchemy. If poles exist, how do we decide to be on one pole versus another? And what does that mean? I don't want to experience hatred or pain or fear. I want to experience their polar opposites. How do I go about manifesting a life in which I can experience those poles rather than the other ones? And the entire principle is, all of these principles are built on mentalism. How do we practically orient ourselves in a way that we can maintain these mental states that are aligned with these poles up here? That's the practical answer to what rhythm is.
I think actually, to bring this to a biblical aspect, I think Jesus actually once said in the Bible subjectively speaking. I'm not claiming Jesus is objectively real. I'm not counting it out either. But he did say once, with encapsulated in the story of the Bible, he said that it's not those who never made a decision, those who were not hot or cold, will be the ones who are punished the most. Does that fall in line with rhythm a little bit? Somehow, like existing in the middle between two polarities?
Absolutely. So neutralize to exist. So yes. Let me slow down a bit. So those who feel the most experience the greatest joy, right? But they also experience the greatest pain. And those
Right.
people who feel the least experience not a lot of pain, but they also don't experience hardly any joy.
That's nihilism, right?
You could attribute this to a person who is nihilistic.
Well, I would say that that's like almost the definition of nihilism. It's choosing
apathy.
to opt out.
Definitely, yeah. And so hanging out at the neutral point is a sure way to go with the flow, right? If you chill out in the neutral point, you go with the flow. And this is perfect, actually, with rhythm. So I'm glad you brought this up, because rhythm reminds me, in studying the Hermetic principles and thinking deeply about what rhythm means to me, it reminds me, one, to live and love without attaching to things, because the nature of polarity is to constantly shift and change, right? So you can never cling to one thing, because you have to be okay with the rhythm. You have to be okay with the tide. You can never get rid of that. So you roll with the punches, you roll with the tides, right?
Can I bring this to a musical aspect and just say that that's kind of what happens when you listen to a song. You can't cling to the chorus because the verse is inevitably going to come. You can't cling to the bridge because the outro will inevitably come. You just have to kind of exist in the present and let it run its course. Does that make sense?
100%. Yeah, and it's a dance, right? It's a sort of interactive dance. Music is. It's not a race to the finish line. If music were to be about the poles, right? If it were to be about one or two of the beginning or the end or the middle or wherever these poles are, everyone would just race to the finish.
Yeah, the best musicians would be the fastest players. I think Alan Watts said that, right?
Exactly, and it has nothing to do with that. It's a interactive, interpretive, beautifully unfolding and enfolding dance in which you go along with the ride. And that's basically rhythm as one aspect of rhythm. It is that principle to go with the flow. But I want to preface that by highlighting what you said about hanging out in the middle and nihilism. And one of my personal philosophies that I'm writing about, and you'll see soon, is the difference, and Schopenhauer talks often about this, is the difference between will and circumstance, and the difference between exerting the force of will. Nietzsche does as well, since you want to talk about nihilism. The force of will versus the circumstance and the world's will, right? You can kind of think dualistically about the self and the world, or you can think about them as one and the same thing. But for the sake of this exercise, we're going to talk about the difference between self and the world in terms of our willpower. I can exert myself and my own will into the world and into my reality. I can decide to get up every day, go to work, punch in, clock out, work for a paycheck, come home, watch TV.
People who believe in the law of manifestation, people who have read The Secret, are going to wonder, is it possible to align your will with the will of the world?
Yeah, and so the secret in terms of the way that it was portrayed, as in the Hollywood televised The Secret, has deep roots in The Secret, which in the perennial philosophy, a lot of that is reflected in the Hermetic principles. So if anyone knows about The Secret or has heard of manifestation or the law of attraction, all this stuff that we're talking about may sound similar.
See, but I've always kind of had the idea that it's not that thinking about certain things attracts what you want. It's that thinking about the things that you want help you think of ways and mechanisms to make that happen.
Yeah, sure, definitely. But that whole discussion, I kind of want to stay away from, just for the sake of the scope of this conversation.
Yeah, because we could probably talk about that for 45 minutes. But yeah,
that's like that's all, manifesting things. I mean, mentalism is what we're talking about here, but I don't want to get into the whole like think about, bring about, believe into existence sort of thing right now. We can do that.
Can I just ask you, like, for my sake, because I'm curious to know, do you believe that it's objectively true that if you think about what you want, it will inevitably come to you?
I believe to various degrees that is true.
Do you think it's possible that it's through the mechanism that I laid out, that thinking about things helps you come up with the ways to make it happen?
Yes, in one aspect. And I also think in a more arcane aspect, it is a product of the fact that reality is causal, and that
Right.
perception, subjectivity, and objectivity and material form require each other. And quantum physics and quantum theory is moving towards this direction as well. That thought and the activity of perception is much more, I guess, a requirement of reality to exist, as reality is of its own accord existing. So I think, to answer your question quickly, I believe personally that the force of will that we exert as human beings has a very large role in reality as a whole. And it's just unfortunate that reductive science is a little behind on this idea, because
Right.
I think it is real.
Well, I do. I actually think this falls in line with rhythm perfectly, because I think it touches a little bit on patterns, and I think the idea of the law of rhythm is that life is a subset of patterns that are all kind of correlating together in an intelligible way that doesn't seem obvious to us at a surface level.
Absolutely. And to say exactly that, we can move on to causation. And again, I want to just say there's so
Perfect
much
segue.
that we're not even talking about. There's so many. We're just so generally speaking about these principles here. I feel almost like silly even having this discussion.
We could do a
But
podcast on each principle in reality.
we could truly, we really could. So I feel at one part of me feels like having this discussion in the way that we are, in the format that we are, is almost like not doing a real service to these things. Almost as like
Although it could be a good intro to somebody who's never encountered them and wants to dig deep further. And that's what I would recommend. If you're watching this and you're actually interested in the things we're saying, I would recommend that you go and unpack these things to their fullest potential.
Please do, because the way that we're describing them does seem a bit superficial.
Right.
And I think definitely people who are more oriented towards scientific thought may just throw them away, but they're really something. So we'll go ahead and move on. So to segue into causation, what you had said, the principle of causation is cause and effect, right? Everything has a cause and there's always an effect, and that nothing is chance. Chance does not exist. What we would call chance, we simply don't have the perception of the cause, and we can't follow it, right? There have been plenty of philosophers and theologists and just people in history who have put forth ideas in dealing with cause and effect, causation. Aristotle being one of the first, talking about the unmoved mover, right? Being God, the concept of the Greek God in terms of Aristotle being the unmoved mover. Because if you look at cause and effect, there's an effect that had a cause, and that cause had to have had an effect.
Yeah.
And you can ride this chain of causation all the way back to the beginning of creation. But what caused the beginning of creation, right? It doesn't make a logical linear sense. And so Aristotle posited the idea of an unmoved mover, because the ancients looked at the world in terms of motion and time. And if causation is a manifestation of time and motion, they're the same thing. You can talk about cause and effect, or this, then, or that. If so, then, because this happened. That's all a manifestation of time and motion and movement and activity. And Aristotle talked about this unmoved mover, the one that in instance of creation, the one that started the creation, but is itself not a part of and not subject to the laws and the rules of the creation itself. Just like in the beginning, we talked about the nothingness creating something, and from the something it goes inwards. It would be that the force behind the nothingness that creates the something would be Aristotle's unmoved mover. And it brings us into causation.
So is that like the idea of God then? Like the idea of, I'm sorry, I'm not fully sure that I'm following, because it seems like the idea of the unmoved mover, something that lies outside of the universe, or that it's unaffected by the universal laws. Wouldn't that be the definition of God itself?
Sure.
Depending on,
Yeah, definitely. And so the idea of causation almost is indicative of the idea of God, right? Because there's no chance. There's no such thing as probability. I mean, probability obviously exists, but probability is the skin or the clothing that we operate within, because we can't understand the true operations. We don't have a strong enough perception of what's actually happening. We can't see the causes. So
right.
That's the principle of causation. Like,
well, the understanding of cause and effect is almost certainly the starting point of science. It's the idea that you expect the future to behave like the past.
Exactly. And so there is truth to causation. I mean, obviously, if I hold my hand over fire, it's going to hurt and burn me, right? There's some cause and effect there. But to answer your question on riding the waves back to the original cause, this is a question that stumped human beings forever, and we found ways to try to answer it by saying that, reality is a causal loop. Consciousness creates reality. Reality creates consciousness. They require each other. And in the very beginning of the first video, we talked about the principle of mind or mentalism, that all is mental, all is mind, because all is of one mind. All is of the all mind, right? The God mind. And that God mind, or I suppose God itself, is creating this reality and then clothing itself in the reality, hiding within the reality itself to be indistinguishable from the reality itself. So that way you could never know it by empirical evidence. You could never know it by measurement. You would just believe. But this is a bit beyond the scope of causation itself. We're just talking about the idea of God, I suppose, because
when I think of the principle of causation, I feel like that my first encounter with it was my first hangover. I realized that you know what I mean, though? It's like you realize, okay, it's midnight. You're about to go to bed, but then your friend says, hey, let's just have one more shot of tequila. And you think, well, it'll make me feel this much better, a slight bit better, but it's going to make me feel that much worse in the morning. And that was my first encounter with realizing what my actions could lead to later on in the future. And then, if you look at it from a psychological standpoint, someone like Jonathan Haidt would actually make the claim, and I think there's some truth to this claim, is that the ability to recognize cause and causation is the number one factor that will determine how successful you are in the Western world. It's almost like delayed gratification, right? If you can recognize that trading a little bit of pleasure today for some security tomorrow is beneficial, you're gonna prosper in the world.
And exactly. I mean, and in terms of mentalism and the whole purpose, because we could talk all day philosophically or conceptually about things, but ultimately these principles were laid down on paper for use practically, right? So how do we practically use this particular principle as we move forward? And in the mental realm, just as you put it out there, and in the human microcosm, understanding that our actions have reactions, and then better understanding what actions lead to which reactions, and having a more firm grasp of that concept and how it will actually manifest in our life, if this, then this, in every instance of our world view, every instance of how we conduct ourselves and our moral ethical codes. If we can better understand cause and effect and understand that relationship, we would put ourselves in a position for success, just like you said.
Right.
Moving and again, to the whole willpower of the individual versus the will of the collective. This is a concept that I heavily include in my writings. I have this idea in which, to put it as quickly and easily as possible, you can imagine the masses of people as one giant person, right? As one giant person with the will. But the larger in scope that you go when it comes to cognition or perception, I guess the collective consciousness, as you grow into that collective, the barriers and boundaries by which the individual has access to kind of break down. And the mass group of people with the collective consciousness, and this is kind of a metaphysical thing we're talking about here, is less prepared as a whole to make willful decisions. It hasn't woken up to its own nature yet. We haven't emerged into ourselves as a people. We've emerged into ourselves as individuals on the biosphere, but are in the new sphere, in the mental area of this sort of metaphysical one human individual composed of multiple humans that we could call people. That's its actual name. You could think about it this way.
Right.
Its name is people. Don't think about multiple people. It's one person named people, created of the collective consciousness. This will is a lot weaker because it isn't aware of its own self in the same manner that you're aware of yourself. But this is we're super digressing here, but I'm
Well,
bringing
no,
this
but
up
how?
because,
What you're saying reminds me of synchronicity, and so I guess I want to ask: how does rhythm play in line with synchronicity?
well, I would say causation would play.
Or I'm sorry, causation. That's what I meant.
Yeah, so causation and synchronicity would be the same thing, different terminology,
Right.
right?
That's what I was. I
Because
was kind of thinking that, but I wasn't sure if it was correct, so I didn't want to make that definitive statement. But it sounds right.
yeah, synchronicity would be more like the New Age version of what Hermetists would call causation.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. Well, but causation sounds more like a practical and objective standpoint than synchronicity. So you could
Sure.
it could almost be like a reductionist viewpoint for somebody that was difficult to convince of these things.
Well, if you think that the way that New Age practitioners and proponents of the New Age ideas of theosophy would use the term synchronicity, they would talk about things that are happening and lining up with each other in a sort of mental or spiritual realm that are coming through the channels of your perception to show you certain things as an individual. In your world as you're experiencing it, these things that are happening aren't just chance. That, like, the things that are lining up right in front of your eyes are being caused by spiritual and mental factors and forces that are unseen. That's the idea of synchronicity. And things are showing, like your angels or your guides or whatever, greater than you things are lining up, and you're perceiving them because you're more in tune with yourself and your higher consciousness. That's the idea of synchronicity in the way that New Age proponents will put it. Causation, in terms of Hermetism, is that cause and effect are interrelated, and that there's no such thing as chance, because all effects have an actual cause, which is quite like synchronicity in the fact that they say if you chalk something up to chance, it is simply because you don't know the cause. Hermetists don't necessarily posit some spiritual cause. They just posit that there is always an actual cause.
Well, whenever a catastrophe would happen to the Jews, they would never attribute it to chance. They would always assume that it was something that they did wrong. They would always assume that somewhere along the path they made a mistake, and that's what caused the tragedy. I think that's a pretty noble way of looking at life.
Sure. I mean, they take responsibility. I mean, again, we can unpack this for a long time, because we can talk about is it their fault? For one, they moved to the location, they settled there, they've been there for a while, so the natural disaster happens to them for being in that particular location. Is it their fault? Did they cause it? Did something that they do actually cause tremors in the earth that created the natural disaster? Or maybe it was something that happened quite like the butterfly effect. millions of years ago, and it just so happens that the particles that formed into the mountain and the particles that formed into the humans that chill on the mountain that blew up at the time that they were happening to live there, could it have been that there were causes way back then that actually led to this disaster? We don't know. We don't have this picture in mind, but the Hermetic principle states that the causes are there, and if you only could perceive them, you would see perfectly the map of the cosmos, and you would be God. That's the idea.
You know, there's an episode of South Park where Eric Cartman drives his boat into the dam, and he basically causes this giant flood that takes out this entire city. And instead of anyone trying to focus on, you know, what caused this, everyone's main objective with this is that, well, why would you build your city next to a giant dam, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know why that reminded me of it, but I feel like that's a perfect example of like, well, yeah, you could try to find some external cause of your misery, but at the same time, why would you build your city right underneath the dam, you know?
Why would you smoke cigarettes? Why would you drive drunk? Why would you, you know, these are questions. These are very easy questions for people to work through, but so many people just never think about this. They don't think about consequences. But this is a very basic principle, right? If you have a child, you're going to tell your child not to go run out into the street because you know that they'll get hit by a car. It's a very basic principle, causation. But the root of it is understanding that nothing is chance. That's the most important aspect of the principle.
And you believe that?
Absolutely, yeah. Because so if we look at, how are we doing on time?
I'm good. I've probably got another 20 minutes.
Wow.
Yeah, I know.
How long have we been talking?
Since 6:50. So it's been about 46 minutes.
Okay, let's go for at least 30 more minutes. Is that
Let's
cool?
try. If somebody walks into my house within that time frame, I apologize.
All right, cool. So
that would be my girlfriend, by the way. So
sure. So to answer the question, and then we'll talk about one more thing, and then we'll move on. Is I mean, if you think about motion, right? We talked about Zoom, the book that I was listening to before, and motion in the cosmos and vibration in the previous video. Let's look at the levels of reality, right? So we've got the physiosphere, the biosphere, the noosphere. The physical reality in which all things are built from. Then you've got your mental reality, and then physical reality, then life emerging out of that physical reality, which is like negative entropy and all this cool stuff happening, and you know, electric pulses creating new things. And it's not just, yeah, we'll get there. But then the biosphere, and then the noosphere, right? These three levels.
Are we still talking about causation?
Yeah. The mind, body, and the spirit, and causation, and how everything is in motion, right? So at the physical level, there's atoms bumping into atoms, molecules bumping into molecules, wind, pressures, heats, colds. All of these changes in state and form of all of these elements in action are causing things to move about and form and be destroyed in this sort of soup of alchemical transaction. Out of that soup comes the biosphere, comes life, trees, plants, fauna, flora. All of this cool stuff is happening. And before, where you have all of this energy interchanging and exchanging itself, and colliding and falling away, all of this chaos, things are coming into form like suns, planets. Things are dying like suns and planets. The biosphere comes to life. Things are dying, things are being born. Out of the biosphere comes primitive minds, amoebas into single-celled organisms, into multi-celled organisms. All this crazy
stuff. This is motion, right? I'm sorry, I'm just
this
making
is all
sure.
Motion. Okay. This is all, think about motion, right? So if we just talk about the physiosphere, we have forces at play before any life. There's just one thing comes, collides with another thing, causes another thing to happen. Newtonian.
Well, earlier you said that the Greeks understood it as time and motion. And I almost feel like motion could be the same thing as space. You know, scientists are very big on space and time. Do you agree with that connection?
They're much different things. Yeah. So motion and space are different things. Motion.
Yeah, but isn't space always in motion?
Yes. However, space and motion aren't the same things. Motion is
I
space
can see that,
in
but at the
time.
same time, space is always in motion, even though space encapsulates everything.
Yeah, all space is always in motion, like all the time, even at the molecular level.
Right.
Definitely. Though there's no such thing as static, absolute rest. We've
Right.
learned that. But the whole idea is that at the physical level, things are bumping and moving, and it's all happening of its own accord via natural law and force. And then at the biosphere, when life first emerges, there, and you can see those causations in the physiosphere. Then the biosphere comes, and then now there's life, and cells are moving, and things are happening. Mitochondria, proteins, things are all happening by their own volition, but still to some degree at the level of natural order and natural law. And then out of this biosphere emerges the mind and the mental state. And then in something like a human being, this mental state is still in accordance with that natural law. It's still happening. All of these forces are still interlocking and moving, and things are bumping into each other. You know, metaphorically, like you and I are having this conversation, your mind is bumping into my mind, and it's ejecting out these ideas that are bumping into other people. There's still this motion in the mental space. But what's different as you move upwards in the evolutionary process is our willpower, our own individual self, our I, is emerging out of that which is a multitude. And as we converge into a oneness out of that which is multiple and one, again, we gain the ability of willpower. And that willpower and conscious perception allows us to discern what's happening in the world by natural law, and then we can exert ourselves upon that world with our own willpower, right? We talked about that a little bit in the first video. But the whole concept of what I'm trying to get to here is that at the physical and biological level, and the mental level and the spiritual level, as you move upwards in this evolutionary process, you can still observe cause and effect, but cause and effect becomes less and less natural and more rooted in willful causation, right? And the understanding of this leads one to take hold and take charge of their power as a human being, because one, through the forces of mentalism, through the Hermetic principles, understands their place in the cosmos and their purpose as a human being that can think and breathe, and it empowers you.
Right.
That's what this knowledge does.
And I think because we have such a deep understanding of what space is and how it's in constant motion, it's not hard for modern humans to understand this idea that everything is in constant motion. That it seems to me like it's one of the easier ideas of Hermeticism to accept, because it's so instantiated in our scientific understanding.
Right. Everything is in motion, including the mental and spiritual planes, right? And understanding that, we, using our willpower, can cause things rather than just trying to measure cause and effect or observe it. We can be the players. We can be the writers of our own story, because we understand the principle. We can understand it, and then we can manipulate it. This is the gift that we have as thinking individuals.
Well, you know, people always say don't hate the player, hate the game, and I fervently disagree, because the game is the game. You know, that's it. You're in the game. But the only strategy that you have is to be a better player.
Exactly. And so that is the whole purpose of these principles, is to make you a better player.
Right. That makes sense. So
Truly,
are we on gender, or are we on, is there a 7?
Yeah, gender is the 7th.
Okay. Yeah. Gotcha. So just to clarify, gender is the final principle, and BJ will take us off.
Yeah, we'll talk about gender and mental gender. So gender, as you know, we live in the postmodern world. People are changing their genders. People are talking about gender. There's freaking gender protection acts for when you get a job. People can't discriminate against you. There's so much happening. Yeah, there's all this stuff. Yeah, there's all this stuff going on in the world right now when it comes to gender. But when it comes to Hermetic principles and gender, the idea is that gender is akin to polarity, that it comes from a place of spirit. and that it permeates every level of reality. It permeates the physical reality, the biological, the mental, the spiritual. Every single aspect of reality is permeated by this force or spirit of polarity and rhythm, in which it's all one, right? But it's all pretending to be different. And it's
Right.
happening through this cause and effect motion as we're putting it all together. There's this big thing happening. But at the root of it, at the spirit of what breathes this entirety into creation, is a principle that's given in the form of a metaphor. And this metaphor is masculine versus feminine aspects
Right.
of the one thing that is.
And
Right?
it comes into fruition in our language. You know what I mean? You see romance languages that literally change the ending of a word based on whether they feel it's masculine or feminine. So this is something that's
Ancient.
been, maybe not been well understood, but it's been such a fundamental part of the fabric of reality that it's come into fruition and through our very own language, the very own way that we speak, like we're doing right now.
Yeah, and that what you just said is huge. Whether or not we consciously are observing things, everything exists on every plane of existence. Everything
Right.
has a reflection. Everything has a shadow, right? Whether or not we're aware of these cause and effects through the principles of mentalism and correspondence in the first video, all things are reflecting on all levels regardless of whether or not
Right.
we understand them. And what you just said is so profound, because whether or not there's been a global or a societal understanding, it's still manifesting in our reality right in front of our faces, and we
Right.
didn't even do it on purpose.
Right.
And this is the concept of gender and language. I just really wanted to point that out and appreciate what you said there.
No problem.
But back to gender. So masculine and feminine, what they actually mean. There's subtle symbols that do permeate everything, and we can posit it this way. If you think about the cross, right? The cross, or no, let's take it a step further. When you sign a document, whether you're a boy or a girl, when you do that, the masculine symbol is an arrow. Or when you played Pokemon as a kid, right? Everybody in the 90s played Pokemon. You played Pokemon. I played Pokemon. When you
Yep.
make your character, or when you get a Pokemon as a boy, it's got a circle and then an arrow pointing to the sky, right? And then if it's a female, it's a circle with an arrow pointing towards the ground, right? You remember that?
Right.
These are symbols that are generally
Is
accepted
there a
today.
reason for that? Why
Yes.
why masculine is pointing towards the sky and
Yes.
feminine is? You want to elaborate on that
Yes.
just a tiny bit?
These have their origins in alchemical processes, but we're not going to go that direction because we're not talking about alchemy today.
Right.
Although
That could be our next podcast.
we could, but we're talking about mental alchemy in the form of mentalism and
Right.
hermetism. So we're just going to
Right.
stay here. But these symbols do have their place in ancient times, and now they're here. But the masculine symbol, or the yang of the yin and yang, and the feminine symbol, or the yin of the yin and yang.
Real quick, I just want to say a great quote from Carl Jung. The moment that everyone agrees on what a symbol means, that's the moment that it's no longer a symbol.
It becomes a concept.
It becomes a concept, right? But symbols, real true symbols, like we said earlier when we first started talking about gender, come into fruition in ways that we can't even anticipate, in ways that we would have never even imagined.
The whole entire cosmos is symbolic.
Right.
Everything is symbol. We can do a podcast about that. It's a very occult understanding that all is
I would
symbol.
love to do that.
Everything is a representation or a reflection of something else that already is or has been, reflecting and creating shadows. These reflections are symbols. Symbols are everywhere. We can't escape them as human beings. We can't escape them at all. But yeah, so masculine and feminine. Masculine, yang, feminine, yin. Masculine pointing up, feminine pointing down. The masculine symbol is a scorching fire. It's fire. All of the fire symbols, fire and air, are masculine because they rise, right? The old alchemical symbols of fire, air, water, and earth. Masculine, fire, air. They rise upwards. Feminine, earth, water. They fall down towards earth. Okay? The rod, like in Christianity or Judaism, the rod is a masculine symbol. A penis is phallic. It's a rod, right? And the womb is feminine. The rod and the womb together create creation, right?
Right.
The sun is a masculine symbol. The moon is a feminine symbol. These are things that have been happening for a long time. The symbols that have been expressed for a long time. The cause is masculine and the effect is feminine, to bring us back to cause and effect. The sperm is a masculine. The egg is feminine. You can see these things happening throughout all levels of reality, of a sort of willpower, which is masculine, spirit coming from a different reality or a different level of reality that's unseen, mind, spirit, spermazoa, coming in through the force of a projection, through a force of a cause, a purposeful cause, being projected, and then combining with the feminine principle, which, if the masculine principle is this willpower of causation, the feminine principle is the reception. It is the Shekinah in Judaism. It's the grounding force. It's the grabbing of the willpower, pulling it in, instantiating it, and giving it form. Femininity, in terms of Hermetic principles, is Gaia. That's why we call, Mother Earth, and then everyone wants to call God the Father, like Father in heaven, but Mother Earth. It's because the Father in heaven, who is not of the earth, who is somehow transcendent, the mind is somehow transcendent from this space, but the mind moves the space. Without space, the mind could not exist. Without my body and my brain, my mind could not exist. So they require each other. It's not that the masculine spirit is somehow better or of a higher degree or order than the physical mother. They come together in the form of creation.
Well, and you literally couldn't have one without the other. I mean, and that's
right.
And nobody can refute that.
And this is polarity.
Everyone knows that there would be no propagation of human beings if it wasn't for the masculine and the feminine. There's no negating that.
And that's the same for all aspects of reality. It's not just the biosphere. It's the noosphere. It's the physiosphere.
Can you explain noosphere to
mental,
me? You've
mental
mentioned. Oh, okay, gotcha.
It's a Wilbur term. Not even Wilbur. It's like a psychology term, but it's
gotcha.
just mental, the mental realm. Which emerged out of the biosphere. But yeah, I mean, this is a concept that permeates all of existence. And it basically is akin to polarity, but it posits that one can't exist without the other. Light can't exist without dark. Dark can't exist without light. However, it's given in a means by which it shows that the poles hold each other in place, right? It shows it.
Do you think we're losing touch with that?
Yes, absolutely. Because
in what way and what would you see as a possible solution?
Well, if you look at what these symbols mean in a societal context, masculine energy is the energy in which we act, right? It's the go-getterness. It's the slayer, it's the warrior, it's the explorer, those who go and bring their that's the masculine force. It's the force of will.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I feel like I already know what you're going to say, but the feminine energy is thinking, and not just thinking, but thinking about the future. It's bargaining with the future to an extent, just like we talked about earlier. The ability to delay gratification is the number one determiner of whether you'll be successful or not.
Exactly. So the feminine principle is reflective. Right, it's very reflective. It's the principle by which, in societal terms, we sit and wait, we look, we observe, we receive, we clothe people that we love. We want to hold people. We want to coddle people. But it's not a negative, like, weak thing. It's more like,
no.
If you can think in physical manifestation, the feminine force gives form to things, and then the masculine form, or the masculine is the will behind that which gives form. In society, masculine energy is the go out and do and the push the boundaries. The feminine form is the hold it down, let's think about it, let's weigh the consequences, let's like make sure our house is in order, let's not go exert ourselves too much. Because if you have too much masculine energy, what happens is war, right?
Mm.
You could think of masculine energy as like a fire that's too much, that's burning a forest down, right? You lit a fire because you're amped up and passionate, and you're going to
Mm.
go out and you're going to start a fire because you're going to go catch a meal, and then you're going to shoot that deer, and you're going to put the deer on the fire, and you're going to cook it and eat it. That's masculine energy. But
Mm.
you've done too much. The flame flickered, caught on fire the forest, and the forest is the feminine energy. The forest is the place that you live. It's what holds everything in place. Without the forest, there's no fire, right? Without the forest, and your masculine energy is just destroying everything because it's unchecked. However, if
Mm.
your feminine energy is too powerful, everything stagnates. There's no motion. Everything becomes still. It's almost akin to chilling out in the very center of the poles.
Is it almost akin to like over-regulation?
I would say in yes and no. It depends. But yes. I mean, ultimately, chilling out at the poles is more of a masculine thing, and then hanging out right in the center, so much so that you do absolutely nothing, is very feminine in terms of the Hermetic principles, right?
Mm.
Because it's stagnation or a reflection. You reflect too long, you take no action, or you
Well,
act too
see,
much.
and I watched an episode of Dave Rubin with Eckhart Tolle. I don't know if did you get to watch that by any chance?
No.
Well, one of the things that he kind of broke down was he was breaking down the masculine and feminine into yin and yang symbols. And he said, well, like you said, the masculine is the yang and the feminine is the yin. And he said, what we've seen over the period of Western history is a huge volume of yang coming into fruition in multiple ways. I mean, you could point those out and say like Nazi Germany or like or Maoist China or whatever you want to say. And what we're seeing right now, I want to preface this by saying I think it's good that we're living in a time that people are able to see things from a compassionate standpoint. I'm not
Sure.
negating the utility of that lens, but what we might be having is an influx of yin as a reaction to this huge volume of yang. And that's what's leading us to the SJW philosophy and the political correctness philosophy and stuff
Sure.
like that. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I mean, looking at things, just if we're going to contain it within Hermetism, I mean, cause and effect, you see polarity, and you see the rhythm in between, and you see people
Wow,
who are autonomously reflecting their environments, because
that's
at the
amazing.
higher levels, you see at the individual level, there's discernment, right? There, you can think of things clearly, but at the
Right.
collective consciousness level, we're still a bit unaware of ourselves. And because of that, we are automatically reflecting things as if the feminine force is taking over in physical space, right? Everyone
Mm.
is very feminine right now in terms of reflectiveness. Everyone is
Right.
just like everyone else. There
Right.
aren't, everyone wants to be just like everyone else. This is a very feminine, reflective, mirroring
Right.
force, right? Grounding. You want to be part of the group. You want to be part of the people. That's feminine. And then we see these causations on this greater collective scale, which leads to greater polarization because less people are aware of their self and the way that they play into the greater collective. And then it leads to this rhythm, and then all are continuing to polarize, and we see the causation. You can see all of this happening. It's all
So
happening.
some people are going to get offended by that. And so I'm going to ask you a question that I actually already know your answer to, because, you and I have had enough interaction where I pretty much know your
Sure.
stance on this. But would you agree that the perfect place between masculine and feminine is somewhere in between?
In terms of masculine and feminine, it is
What I'm saying is we don't want to be too masculine and we don't want to be too feminine. We want to
So
be, we want to combine the good traits of both and amalgamate them into a worldview that's constructive and
Sure.
practical for everybody.
Yes, but that's not the same thing as being in the middle.
Yeah,
So
see, that's kind of because it seems like throughout this discussion, we've at one point a few principles ago, we were saying it's good to live in the middle. But then when you get into stuff like this, it seems a little bit more complex, and it's so complex that I actually don't understand it. And I would like you to maybe help me understand it.
There's a difference between living in the middle and living at both sides of the poles.
That makes sense.
Simultaneously,
right? That's what I was getting at.
What I think of it as is as if it's the lotus flower. I very much envision the lotus flower when looking at reality. The lotus flower being a Buddhist symbol in which reality is constantly unfolding, and then enfolding, and then unfolding and enfolding. And this, you can never escape any of these 7 Hermetic principles. They're always going to be part of your reality. You can never escape polarity. So chilling out in the center is just a surefire way to be a dead, soulless zombie of an individual.
Right, and we talked earlier about splitting yourself, right? But see, the place that my mind goes is that, okay, I have a question, and I'm gonna split myself into the masculine and the feminine answer, and let them kind of and let them kind of battle it out. But it seems to me that when you do that, you do end up somewhere in the middle.
You could call it the middle, but I don't call it the middle.
You call it both.
Yes.
That makes sense to me.
Cognitive dissonance is like part of my world, because the thing is that the reality of reality is that it's all one, but it expresses itself as a multitude, right? That the Hermetic principle, as we've spoken about it, reality is one that expresses itself as a multitude. So if you think of gender as one thing that's manifesting itself as a multitude with a polar spectrum, with polarity and a spectrum in between, we should not hang out in the neutral zone necessarily. We should find a means by which we can unfold our lotus and enfold our lotus at the same time. The unfolding and the enfolding are essentially the 2 sides of the poles, right?
Right. I appreciate the thinkers who are able to have a debate, and yet, even though they have a strong stance in that debate, they can still articulate the arguments from the other side. And I feel like those are the most profound thinkers. And you know, God, I feel like we bring up Jordan Peterson every podcast. This isn't a Jordan Peterson podcast, but man, he does the greatest job of doing that. When you watch him debate Sam Harris, it's like he's taking the position of the non-atheist. Yet it seems as if he understands the arguments of atheism better than Sam Harris does.
Sure. And it's this sort of balance that we want to achieve, but I wouldn't think of it or envision it as being a static point in the middle of a spectrum. It's like the lotus flower. You have both parts of the spectrum actually doing their piece simultaneously in harmony. When you look at the yin yang symbol, that's why the center isn't a line. It's not a circle with a line that's fixed and rooted. You know, it's a wave pattern, because as the yin and the yang are battling for supremacy, perfectly holding themselves in balance, substantiating their own existence, like we said, with the nothing and something to anything. The in-between of that experience is not a static thing. It's always a dance, just like music. So in society, this whole polarization, or saying we need to be in the middle, or trying to find a means by which everyone is happy, is not the answer. We should find a means by which we integrate everyone's ideas together, but that's a whole different conversation.
Well, it's technically impossible to take into account everybody's unhappiness.
Absolutely.
You what you want to do, and I was a manager in sales for a long time, and this speaks to that philosophy of how to be successful in that industry. But you can't take into account everybody's situation, but what you can do is you can try your best to create an environment to where everyone can swim as best as they can.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And giving people tools like these Hermetic principles can help a lot, especially because they're the very foundation and the very beginning location. The Kabbalion,
Right.
in general, is a very preliminary text for most people who begin their descent into more esoteric things. But before we end the podcast or move that direction, last thing I
Real
want to
quick,
talk
I just
about.
want to say one thing. What I am going to do for people is I am going to combine the audio from the first part and the second part, because what I do think people will find is that there's so many correlations between each principle, and we kind of went over them throughout this journey.
Briefly,
Briefly, yeah. We would talk about principle 1, and then we'd move on to 3, and then we would relate 3 to 1, and then we'd get on to principle 5 and relate 5 to 3, and that's kind of like the. I mean, first of all, that's the definition of an archetype, is that there's unlimited layers of truth in these things, but that's why we really encourage people who are just experiencing this at the surface level to really go unpack these things, because you'll find that there's not only is there unlimited layers of truth, but there's unlimited correlation between one principle and another.
Absolutely.
You could spend a lifetime studying the correlation between principle 1 and principle 7.
Yeah, and what they mean to you and where you can find examples of them in your life and at the different levels of reality that you can see these things manifesting. It really is huge. It's like you know that saying, like, how does it go? It's like easy to learn, difficult to master. Like a video game or like a sport or like a board game or something, you can market it as, this is easy to learn. You can learn it in 10 seconds, but it's hard to master. Like checkers, right? Like you can learn checkers in 2 seconds, but it's hard to be the best at checkers, right?
Right.
It's the same thing. The Kabbalion, the Hermetic principles, they're very generalized, sort of for the lay person, esoteric knowledge that's laid out in 130 pages worth of a tiny little book, and you can read it in 2.5 hours of a sitting, and or you can take your time and spend a lifetime reading it. You know what I mean? It's one of those things where we can really dive into it, really get at the root of some things, and give some definite, detailed examples of, this, and this are exact examples of this one principle,
Right.
and this, and this, and this, and this, or we can just give it to you generally, and then you can go figure it out yourself. And that's kind of the essence of esoteric knowledge to begin with, is figuring things out for yourself. So I do encourage anybody who listened all the way through, thank you. And there's one more thing I want to talk about, mental gender, but I just wanted to throw that out there. Go out, read the Kabbalion, research some Hermetic stuff, start your descent into the occult world, because there's a lot of beauty here.
And a good place to start in the realm of the occult is by adding BJ Carpenter on Facebook, because you will be surprised with not only his ability to convey information, but his ability to listen and respond to feedback. And I've always commended you for that. So
lots of love. But yeah, so there's one more thing I want to talk about if we have time. It's just mental gender. So what do you think?
My girlfriend could be walking in the house any moment. How long do you think it'll take?
I can go quick. Let's just dive into it.
Yeah.
So gender being the last principle, there's also an aspect of gender, of mental gender, right? Because we talked about earlier of the principles of mentalism, all being one mind, and the principles of correspondence, that nothing exists on one level separate from all the other levels, reflections, causation, vibration, it's all happening, all reflecting at every level. Gender permeates everything, including the mental space. And as we describe gender symbolically, being, like the womb, the effects, masculine is the sperm, the cause. Mentally, when it comes to your self-identity, there is a duality that exists, right? And modern psychologists described it as the unconscious, the subconscious, and the conscious mind, right? These are the permutations of this sort of polarization in modern psychology, but the Hermetists described it as the dual mind. They understood it as the I versus the me, right? The me, when you ask someone who they are, if I say, Connor, who are you? What would you say?
I am.
Right, but you have some knowledge.
Yeah.
If you go to someone on the side of the road and say, "Who are you?" They may say, "I'm a doctor," or "I'm a brother," right?
Or
Or
I'm Connor.
I'm Connor, right? So you would answer with these sort of answers which are clothing, right? It's the skin. It's not what or who you are. There are things that you do, right? Your opinions, the things that you take part in your day-to-day life. I might say I'm a skateboarder or I'm a cook. You know, that's all of these things that you identify with are what the Hermetists would call the me of the dual mind. Your
Mm,
feelings, your tastes, your likes, your opinions, your habits, your personality. This is the me. It's the subject by which things are happening to you. It
mm.
corresponds to the principle of rhythm. The me is the ever-changing me. The me is not the same me today as I was 10 years ago,
Or two
right?
seconds ago.
Exactly. The me 5 minutes ago. The me 2 years ago, the me 4 years ago was in Washington working for a state agency. The me now is in Idaho working for the private sector. The me 20 years ago is playing Pokemon. The me today, we think of ourselves subjectively as having an identity that's built of things that exist out of our subjective experience, right? And we take those subjective experiences and we forge them into what we would call our personal identity. This is the me aspect of the dual mind, according to the Hermetists. And it's again subject to rhythm because rhythm is ever changing in between the poles. We are ever changing in our me, right? I'm always changing my clothes, I'm changing my opinions, I'm changing my tastes.
Right.
These are the me's. Rhythm. And it can change by the force of will, right? Because I, by my own force of will, like you are, can think, practice metacognition, pause, hold up, let me think about why I have an opinion. Let me use my willpower to take a second and really try to put some effort into it and change my opinion. And then now I'm a new me, right? My me is
Mm,
changed through the rhythm of the poles via the force of the causation and the effect of my willpower being the I, the
right.
observer, right? The witness is the I. The I is in terms of Eastern philosophy, the I is that which is. The I is the being, and the me is the becoming. The I is forever, and the me is the manifest. The I is the unmanifest, that which you cannot see. The me is that which can be seen. The me is feminine. The I is masculine. And it's funny because I is a pole, and poles are phallic, and phallic symbols are masculine. But the I is the observer. Alan Watts talks about the observer. Eastern Buddhism,
Jesus
philosophy,
said the body
Hinduism.
is thine, the body is an eye. If thine eye be single, then thy whole body shall be full of light.
Yes, so the I would be the observer behind the eyes, that which always is. The thing that makes you separate from the rest of reality is the I. And the me is that which you build yourself to be through the faculty and the process of the I, right? The I is the higher self. The me
Right.
is the self that you identify with. The I is the soul. The me is BJ.
I don't know definitively whether or not I believe in God, but I will say that one of the principles that made it kind of fun to play around with the idea was the thought that my eyes are like the spies for God,
Yeah,
like my
definitely.
eyes are are reporting back to the
Yes.
all.
Yeah, sure. And if God's omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient, then all the your eyes are reporting back to the one God, to the I, right? But the
Mm,
me, which is you, is the one God fooling itself. It's this weird causal loop, right? Where your eyeballs are feeding back to the source of the oneness,
mm,
but at the same time, you believe yourself to exist as a separate entity from that oneness. And there's an infinite chasm of quote unquote space in between you and that which is everything. There's an infinite amount of space between you and me. If we were to hug each other, there would still be an insurmountable amount of space between your consciousness and my consciousness. The
right.
I of you and the I of me, right? This is the me speaking. But the I is the thing that gives life and form and spirit to both your me and my me. It's the same I. that's the idea of the dual mind. And it's back to and ending it on this idea of dual mind between me being BJ and I being the greater I, the greater you, connecting to each other, is going back from the seventh principle of gender and mental gender, looping back to the principle of mentalism, which is the first principle, touching each other at the poles, okay? Because the first principle, mentalism, all is one mind, and the principle of gender, number 7, dualism, dual gender, mental, masculine, feminine, I, me, and then this greater I versus the me touching the oneness is actually the lotus flower unfolding and enfolding back upon itself of the principles, number 1 and 7, touching at the poles of 1 through 7 and unfolding and looping causally as this entire set of Hermetic principles is giving form to all of manifestation. Do you see
Right.
that? Can you visualize that?
Yeah, I can actually. And I one of the things that I think you always do a great job is not only explaining things, but explaining them in a way where I can put together a kind of mental image that makes it more clear. And I commend you for that. So thank you very much. And BJ, man, I love having these conversations with you. They're always so insightful, so stimulating. And I want to have you back on the podcast. Me and you are going to have to do some corresponding to figure out what our next one would be, because you and I could pretty much talk about anything. But thank you for coming on, man. I really appreciate it. I think everyone who's just kind of getting into this stuff is really going to find this conversation insightful. So thank you.
I hope so, man. I hope more people listen. Your show is awesome. I've been
Thank you.
enjoying listening to your podcast. I can't wait for you to blow up. And I'm really, I'm down to write, do anything, edit.
Yes.
I'm really glad to be on. I'm glad that you like talking to me about stuff, man. That's what I live for. So.
Absolutely. Well, the blog is out. BJ will be writing a piece for it soon, I'm sure. Got a couple other writers who are really intelligent coming on. There's, more than anything, I just want to say that your guys' engagement is like so humbling. I never expected to even get this far. I didn't expect to get this many people interested. So thank you all. And I'm not asking for anything, but we're so close to the donation threshold of being able to get some better equipment, some better production via Fiverr to get like some music and some logos in the beginning. So we're so close to that. So if you are in a position to help, and you feel like this show could pay off, then I would really appreciate that. If not, seriously, I just love the fact that everyone's engaging. I love the open discussion on the group and on the page and in the Discord. So thank you guys all for participating. And BJ, you're one of those people. So thank you again.
Yeah, man. There's one more thing I want to say, and no, you don't have to thank me. Thank you. This is my pleasure, man. I really enjoy being here. I want to say that what you're doing in your life right now is very akin to these principles, because the whole purpose of talking about these principles, and I may have not explained this quite clearly enough. I don't feel, thinking back. The whole purpose of everything that we've talked about in these last 2 videos is to give people the basic understanding of the Hermetic principles in order to practice mentalism, so that they can manifest in their life through their power of masculine will into their feminine creation what they want from their I, so their me can prosper. And so that way people will not be subject to the ebb and flow and the rhythm of the tide, and they won't be stuck on a pole of polarity. They can, through their willpower, manifest the direction of life that they want, to get out of life what they want, and to be happy and to chill at the poles that they wish, instead of being subject by circumstance and by causation outside of their willpower and understanding. Instead of being a subject to that, they are a player in the game of life. That's the whole purpose. And what you're doing in your life with looking at thoughts that you have, challenging yourself, challenging your ideas, taking these huge leaps, starting a podcast, doing a blog, writing a book, challenging yourself, going out and fighting the odds of the world, rather than being an autonomous reflection, rather than going out and working a job that you hate and barely struggling to live and pretending to be just an automatic reflection, an overly feminine aspect of the rest of the world. You're incorporating your masculine energy of creation, willpower, thought in a balanced way with feminine principles of your own self, looking at yourself, and then doing all of this all at once, whether or not you realized what you're doing, but you're doing it and you're making positive changes in your life, and it's showing fruit, right? You've sown the seeds and you're putting in the work and you're watering those seeds. And whether or not you are on purposefully using these principles, you have been in a lot of different ways, and it's showing in your world. And I don't want to speak for you, but I'm pretty sure you're feeling pretty good every day.
Well, yeah, and thank you, by the way. If it wasn't for people like you to come forth and challenge my ideas, it wouldn't be possible. So I really appreciate it, but it's all polarity, right? It's without, there's me, and then there's the people challenging me. Without either one, it's not possible. So I really appreciate that, man. Thank you.
Hell yeah, dude. You're doing great. And it's really inspiring, man. And much love. I can't wait to do it again.
Wait a sec. Do you hear that? The perfect way
timing?
to end. That's the perfect way to end the podcast.
Is she coming in? Is she coming inside?
No. I just felt something in the air that I wanted to point out. You feel it?
Well,
I feel it.
I feel it, man.
All right, man. Well, thank you for coming on, man. Thank you for all the kind words. Seriously, it means a lot, man. And I know I've said this like 50 times, but the conversations I've had with you are some of the most insightful. So I really appreciate it.
Hell yeah, dude. Much love. Thanks a lot.
Hey, no problem, man. Have a good one, BJ.
You too.